So we've been having a series of lectures. For those who don't know, the Frankie Lectures are part seminar, part lecture series. We want to give thanks to the Frankies for supporting this fantastic endeavor. What we end up doing, we have a group of students, undergraduates, who are involved in a seminar called The Secret Life of Radio that I've been running. They've been wonderful students. It's an amazing seminar so far. And as part of that, we get to bring wonderful guests to come and sit in on the seminar, to teach us, to read their work, and to give a public lecture. So tonight, I am thrilled to get to introduce to you David Goan, who is a journalist, a field recorder, a sound mixer, and an expert listener with a keen ear for auscultating what might be thought of as the fringes of mass media radio, in particular shortwave radio and pirate radio. So in the seminar today, we focus on his work documenting the history and the ongoing relevance of pirate radio in Brooklyn, about which he's going to speak tonight. David's work examines this ongoing role of radio to cohere communities, especially those diasporic communities that have no place that's officially allotted to them in the media. And David's work, in ways that are empathetic, rigorous, and ethical, shines a light on those communities that fall between the cracks of FCC regulation, where individuals set up small-scale transmitters to speak their truth, to share music, and to disseminate information about homelands, distant and local, and refuse to abrogate their access to the airwaves. So for those in the audience, I highly recommend listening to David's radio documentaries on pirate radio. I'm sure you'll be talking a little bit about this and pulling from it tonight, and visiting this amazing project called the Brooklyn Pirate Radio Sound Map, an incredible online sound map that allows you to sort of live in the world of Brooklyn's pirate radio. It's a kind of model, I think, in some ways of what digital humanities and public humanities could be doing. The website functions as both an archive of the sounds of Brooklyn's pirates or micro-broadcasters, as well as offering an experiential interface that really lets you tune in and get a sense of the geographic spread of Brooklyn's pirate sounds. David has created programming for NPR's Lost and Found Sounds series, Jazz at Lincoln Center, Afropop on the Media, as well as audio-based work, audio-based installations for Proteus Goanus, the Ethnographic Terminalia Collective, and Radio Kona. And over the past 25 years, he's recorded everyone from, as he says on his website, the Dalai Lama to the dancing chicken of Chinatown. So a brief list of some of his clients will reveal for you how prolific and in demand he is. He's worked for the BBC, the CBC, NPR. I guess radio loves acronyms as much as music theory does. He's done for the LA-based KCRW and KPCC, and a bevy of shows that are going to be familiar to anybody who listens to public radio, such as The World, Here and Now, Marketplace, etc. It is really my pleasure to introduce to you David Goan, and we're so pleased to have you here with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Gosh, thanks, Brian. And thanks to Brian for putting all this together, and to Kat Slowick for coordinating the series. I'm so honored and excited to be part of this. All of the speakers in this series have been influential to my thinking about the many worlds of radio, its influence on community, and the need for its preservation. So my talk is called Tracing Neighborhoods in the Sky, New York City Pirate Radio. Every day in New York City, radio waves spill from antennas connected to hidden transmitters, transgressing physical and legal boundaries to wrap immigrant communities in threads of invisible signal. Pirate radio acts as a conduit, bringing the sounds of the ancestral home to a new home, transforming time, space, and culture.
Passing through. Hey, I'm going to tell it to you. Yes, sweet reggae music. Yaga yo. We from the West Indies. We grew up with the cool breeze. Oh, hear me now, hear me now. They call it Bimsham. Grenada, they call it Spice Island. Trinidad, they call it TNT. St. Lucia, they call it Lucian. Jamaica, they say Jam Down. America, they say American.
So do you listen to radio from home, here?
Yeah, man.
What do we hear?
Right here in New York City, you have 1,000 Caribbean stations.
Join the revolution. The radio revolution. 104.7. You on Team 104.7 FM.
You kidding me? You stick around. But remember,
Vibes up, how you bad, sir? How you bad, sir? How you rude, sir? New York City want a taste of that. Vibes up radio to just too real and dangerous. Number one, cause you know it's dangerous.
So that clip featured some of the IDs of some of the prominent pirate radio stations in Brooklyn, and it also featured DJ Daddy Lotto, who was hanging out on the street, partying with his friends one night in Flatbush, Brooklyn, as I passed by walking down the street. The sounds of that street rise into the ether from pirate radio studios and reflect down again onto tight-knit communities. They're often struggling economically, politically, and because of that, are disconnected from access to traditional media. So what is pirate radio? They're homegrown radio stations without a government license, using, the government and radio industry would say, stealing the frequencies of local licensed stations, causing interference to the licensed stations, reducing their range and revenue, potentially blocking emergency alert messages that those stations are mandated to carry, and not broadcasting those messages themselves. There are other potential harms: interference to air traffic control and other public safety communications, unsafe radio frequency radiation from the antennas and the buildings that they operate in. There's a debate over how far these latter concerns go beyond theoretical. Either way, pirate radio is illegal, and that makes the people who run them subject to penalty, fines, raids, possible arrest, and jail time. The term pirate has been applied to radio as far back as 1926, when a Chicago station switched to a frequency reserved for Canadian stations. The government called it wave piracy. In 1960s Great Britain, there were offshore stations on ships in response to No Rock and Roll on the BBC, and these were naturally called pirates. Pirate often, but not always, has been used as a badge of honor by unlicensed broadcasters, here and also in the UK's very active London scene. Among the West Indian stations in New York City, I hear the term underground used more often. There have been other terms. Bootleg, in the early days of radio, often referred to a station that was just imitating the format of a commercial station and just sort of pretending to be that station. Clandestine, controversial, political stations with anti-government messaging. Free radio, the 60s era and beyond. Microcasting, more applied in the 90s progressive political movement. So what makes them illegal? What's the mechanism and subject to penalty? It's the Federal Communications Act of 1934, which mandated licensing as a remedy for an overcrowded broadcast band in the early days of radio. So, there's part of the Communications Act is called Part 15, where you can actually legally operate a station without a license, but at such a low power that the signal doesn't carry more than like down the hallway. Running enough power, 1 watt, 10 watts, 100 watts, 1,000 or more, to reach your neighborhood or small town without an official license is in violation of the act. I suspect that many pirates in New York City think or hope that they're legal under Part 15. So here I have up here, there you go. This is from the FCC's site. So this is what Section 301 of the Communications Act of 34 prohibits: the use or operation of any apparatus for the transmission of energy or communications or signals by radio without a license issued by the FCC. And at the bottom they say, the Commission takes enforcement of Section 301 seriously. Parties found operating radio stations without FCC authorization will be subject to a variety of enforcement actions, including seizure of equipment, imposition of monetary forfeitures, ineligibility to hold any FCC license, and criminal penalties. And one thing about the Communications Act of '34 is it was slanted toward licensing radio stations operating as businesses, making money by selling advertising. In the earlier days of radio, there was a reform movement that saw that it should be non-commercial and available to all different kinds of groups. And the commercial industry, there was really no commercial industry. It wasn't even thought that there was commercial potential, but through networks, banding together, an industry formed and thought that, wow, we can make a lot of money. So the Communications Act was tilted to disfavor awarding licenses to special interests and community radio groups like unions, religious organizations, other groups. And in the words of pirate radio scholar John Anderson of DIYmedia.net, this led people into radical acts like putting illegal stations on the air. So here's a satellite map of New York City, and as DJ Daddy Lotto said earlier, there are 1,000 Caribbean stations in New York City. Well, not quite, but there are at least 60 or 70, almost as many as there are legal stations. And adding in the other broadcasters, there's well over 100. In the Orthodox Jewish community, there are also several stations, and there's an ongoing debate as to whether these are anointed by God or a shanda for the goyim, as my grandmother would say. So take a look at the map. Here are the major general areas where there are pirate radio stations. The Bronx, which is mostly Latinx and West Indian. Queens, which is Latinx, and there is one Chinese language station in Flushing that I'm aware of. In Brooklyn, where there are well over 30 stations broadcasting every day to the east, to Flatbush and East Flatbush, there are West Indian and a few Orthodox Jewish stations. And in New Jersey, it's sort of a mix of those, West Indian and Latinx. I'm not sure about the Jewish stations out there. So why do these communities have these stations? Generally, it's the ones that have very strong cultural, historic ties to radio. New York City has a storied pirate radio scene, not just for the past 25 years, which is when these diverse community-oriented, immigrant community-oriented stations started, but it goes back to the late 60s, and a little later we'll check that out and see what it was like then and how and why it changed. This current phase of this particularly grassroots community-focused pirate activity, as I said, goes back to the 90s. And it was sparked by the elimination of low-powered licenses under 100 watts in the 1970s by the FCC. Public stations at the time were encouraged to become bigger and serve larger audiences. Skyrocketing rates for media airtime in the 90s, consolidation of formats after the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was passed, which put no limits on the number of stations a broadcaster could own. So they were more inclined to, leave out the smaller formats. And that also raised the cap from 4 stations to 8 that one single owner could have in a major market. The high cost of starting a station, which is in the multiple millions of dollars, even well over $100 million. And few frequencies available on an already crowded dial, combined with the availability of cheap, easy to operate transmitters from China. So you could get on the air for maybe $1,000 or even less. In the 90s, there was also a rising nationwide free radio or microcasting movement, started a little earlier in the mid-'80s, that ignited fast-growing neighborhood networks of unlicensed stations. Many activists like Stephen Dunifer of Free Radio Berkeley made transmitters and sent them out to people who would start their own stations. There were many. In Tampa, there was a scene, this guy, L.D. Brewer, he would send out stations, and so there were many different branded stations. San Francisco was another hotbed of progressive political stations. And most of that movement was anarchist, radical, progressive. The immigrant community-focused pirates, they were somewhat separate from that movement, but they took energy from what became a snowballing cross-country civil disobedience of likely 1,000 stations. This was in the 90s. After a protracted period and court injunctions, the FCC finally offered a new low power, 100 watts or less, license class called LPFM, low power FM. There was very strong industry opposition from the National Association of Broadcasters, the industry lobby group, and sadly, NPR. They really fought this hard. And there was a licensing window in the early 2000s, and then it all kind of shut down. Rules were put in place to keep these stations out of the top 5 markets. So what happened was, and also if you were caught previously running a pirate station, you could not apply. So some people have said, you know, they were like Rosa Parks, but then they couldn't take advantage of the new freedoms that came about. In terms of the urban pirates, the ones we were talking about, they were left out because of the spacing rules. There was really no room for them. So they just kept on. They generally did not apply for low power FM licenses. So in New York City, you still have well over 100 stations on the air. A kind of safety in numbers and a bureaucratic and underfunded system of FCC enforcement keeps them on the air. So, who listens? What do they listen to? And why is radio still meaningful to them, especially with so many other choices in the digital realm?
Bachata, cumbia, merengue.
What's your name?
Angel Lopez. I work in 1703 Foster grocery store, and I always listen to the radio. I think it's an alternative from the regular stuff that you get every day, even though it's illegal. Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's still there.
My name is John Luke. I listen to some radio because it's a sense to know exactly where you are, and that's what I'm telling you in Flatbush when I'm listening to the radio station. I'm trying to get the music from the environment where I live, which is basically giving back to me the Haitian, the Trinidadian, and the Jamaican one. So I got it.
Yo, mon bouclier, mettez Walls Mix, ma coûté la radio,
I'm Dr. Reverend Saunders. Radio is still wonderful. Start listening to the radio. You draw your own picture. You hold it faster than when you just lay back. Okay, the TV will show me. See, whereas if you do it from the radio, there's so many things you can imagine. There's so many things you can put together.
Vous écoutez la voix du peuple. Vous écoutez la voix du peuple.
These underground, unlicensed, or pirate stations have been around for as long as there's been radio. I came across it at a very young age. I was probably like maybe 3, 4, or 5 years old. And there was this really popular station back in the late 80s called Vajragina. And it was based in Brooklyn. Nobody knows where it was. There are suspicions, but all I know is from Friday night all the way to Sunday night, you would just hear a series of these stations every weekend, and it would be the place where you can listen to the latest in Haitian pop music, Haitian rap music. It was also the news. Like my parents and their friends would all sit around the radio and they would just be politicking in the living room, getting really loud, dancing, singing along, that sort of thing. It was just like a meeting ground, and the radio was guiding it.
So it's interesting to me because these 4 listeners, they relate to the stations in different ways. Angel Lopez, the first guy, there he is, he works in my local bodega, and he likes to listen to, he's from the Dominican Republic, and he likes to listen to the Haitian stations because it reminds him of an older form of merengue. And he listens when he drives around, and in a way, and this is true, in a lot of New York, the bodega he works in is sort of like a radio station in and of itself. They have huge speakers, and so it's just sort of part of the culture that he lives and works in. The second person is Jean-Luc. He's a drummer, a filmmaker from St. Lucia. He listens to locate himself within the feeling of his neighborhood. Haitian stations for the French culture, Jamaican Trinidadian for the dominant Caribbean music styles. And he actually doesn't know, or he didn't know when we were talking, that these are unlicensed stations. And he actually doubted that they were when I told him about the status, because they just sound real and authentic to him. And that's a common view 25 years down the road after these stations started. They are just accepted as being radio stations. They don't really think about it. When the FCC commissioner, who does not like pirate radio stations, talks about the pirates, he puts radio stations in quotes. But for these people, there are no quotes. They just feel real. Joan Martinez grew up Haitian American, and it was just part of her life growing up. And it became to the point where she's been a broadcaster on several of the stations, which developed through family connections. It's a very big family feeling in the Haitian radio scene. She's working on a film about the stations for her master's at Brooklyn College, which is in the zone of the stations. And when her professor, the aforementioned pirate radio scholar John Anderson, was talking about the stations in class, she said, I'm on one of those stations. So she has a very keen insight. There's her logo, and we're going to listen to what she has to say about just the entirety of the Brooklyn pirate radio scene.
If you happen to have like a regular radio, like the classic antenna that you have to adjust either this way or that way, or a boombox or something, chances are, like, once the sun goes down, all of a sudden, everything that was, like, static throughout the day, you hear music, you hear voices. Sometimes it's in Russian, sometimes it's Hebrew, sometimes it's a preacher.
Talk about the power of God. I want to talk about the anointing. I want to talk about the Holy Ghost. When you have the Holy Ghost, you can go through stuff. My God.
Sometimes it's Haitian, Spanish, Jamaican, West Indian, it doesn't matter. It's just like this whole new spectrum. And there's just something so cozy about that. You know, because you feel like when you're on the other end of the spectrum,
The disco with high hopes.
it's like, yeah, this is so American and this is so popular and yay. But then you go into that other side and it's like, ooh, another perspective. Oh, people are talking. What are they talking about?
When all is peace and safety, when the water's calm, everything pan the level, everything cook and curry, you only see one side of a person, one facet of their personality, and one aspect of a situation. But
It's like the radio becomes like the second world. You know, and then you hear the overmodulation, you hear the DJ. And I really feel like the FCC really screwed the pooch on that, no offense. But I just feel like the intent is to kind of serve the community. And because you're relying on corporations, it's like you're missing out like this whole other spectrum. You're missing out on that. Sometimes you want to hear a voice on the radio.
If you're listening to all my Spanish people out there, buenos tardes. ¿Cómo está? Come on, praise the Lord with me, yes indeed. Sí, señor.
那么当中的 X 特遣队成员众多，目前官方尚未给出地详细的介绍。外媒猜测呢
any children? Oui, Washa avec deux chiens. Yes, I have 4 children, 3 cats, and 2 dogs.
Você é um fã que ganhou mademoiselle Franchard.
Come to America, a lot of stuff is happening with immigrants.
But that's the problem.
We have
Trump doesn't want to welcome KKK Russian. Trump doesn't want to welcome people to America. And welcome to America. Hey, why shouldn't you be welcome? Because you're black, because you're brown, because you're gay, because you're Jamaican, because you're Trini, because you're Nigerian? Why shouldn't you be welcome to America? That's the big problem here.
Hey, I tell you the word that we cut in all them dubs. It's PQD, my producer. A hooligan, the #1 producer in the land. They calling him the champion.
Boom. So that's, I think Joan describes it. She's very articulate in talking about how it all comes together in the skies above Flatbush. So this is the area that she's primarily listing in, Flatbush and East Flatbush in Brooklyn. And when you listen, you will hear the major thoroughfares described, Utica Avenue, Rogers Avenue, in advertisements and the DJs talking. So this is where there's the largest concentration of Haitians in New York City, about over 90,000. And there's also large Jamaican and Trinidadian populations, and the content of the pirate stations reflects that. So this is a chart I made a couple weeks ago. Every hour between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m., I made a scan of what I was hearing on the FM dial. So when I woke up, they were a little under 20. By mid-morning, it was down to 7. And some of those stations, they don't even run programming. They keep their silent signal on, sort of reserving the frequency so no one else will jump on it. And then it ticks up during the afternoon, and by between 5:30 and 7:30, many more come on, and along about 8 o'clock, there's between 28 and 33 stations, all broadcasting to this small area of Brooklyn. A lot of what you'll hear during those hours are newscasts from Caribbean countries. They will run feeds from networks in Jamaica and Trinidad and Haiti. You can hear all about the local elections in Grenada. And there's, like we heard a little snippet of, there's immigration advice shows. Lawyers will come on and they'll take calls and they'll update about what's going on with that. So I've been listening in a concentrated way to the way pirate radio is used in Brooklyn, particularly through the several projects over the past 5 years from my house in Brooklyn, which is somewhere around here. So I'm in a really good zone to hear these stations. And there's a shape to it. During the week, this is how it works. During the weekend, they are on continuously from Friday night to Sunday. And then Monday morning, the stations switch off automatically, mostly, when the people who run them and the people who listen to them go to work, for the most part. Now we're going to take a quick look at what a lot of my research led to. This is the Brooklyn Pirate Radio sound map. And this is basically an archive of this, the sounds that I've been collecting and listening to. Hold on.
אותנו האמינו, ההיסטוריה לא מחיה, ולעולם גם לא תצליח, שיקח בורא עולם, לפני עמו הבטיח, ארץ האבות, כתוב בכך קיים שגם כבשן האש, לא יחלה אברהם, רבים שנשרפו ונעקדו על האופניים, מהווים את ההוכחה לעול מלכות שמיים, ביקרתי אחד של חול, שלא יכול על ים, איך נצטרף אל חבר רבנו וכולם.
Yes, that's Hebrew Reggae Dance Hall. This was from a very short-lived Orthodox Jewish station, which tried to come on the air and didn't last. But I'm playing this to show just the unusual cross-cultural occurrence that you'll hear on the radio. So I think of the sound map as kind of a sonic ethnography with a couple helpings of journalism and several sides of soca, reggae, Caribbean gospel music, and klezmer and Sephardic Jewish music. I wanted to sketch the breadth and the depth of the soundscape created by the dozens of unlicensed stations broadcasting openly yet illegally in Brooklyn. These stations, they're not there by design, but they exist through a combination of aspiration, persistence, and need. So the map shows the area that the stations broadcast to. I'm not showing, and I do not know, unless I there's an antenna on top of a building. I don't know where these stations are broadcasting from. And if you look at some of the FCC data where stations have been tracked and warned to go off the air, often they don't go off the air, but they get a warning. Sometimes they're broadcasting from outside the area. In some cases, from skyscrapers in Manhattan, you know, with the antenna hidden somewhere. So I'm trying to be discreet about this information, but on the other hand, it's a very public scene. You walk down the street, you'll see posters, the stations give out phone numbers, they all have websites, but I felt like to preserve this information was something that I wanted to do. So here's how it works. So you can just use the tuner. It will load playing a sound, and then you can just click up and down the dial.
If you're listening to all my Spanish people out there,
I just got a represent, you know. He said, she said. Yes.
Radio Élégance, la reine de la voix antillaise à New York, son programme C'est un tiers, dédié à...
There's another way that you can use the map. These are the main zones that stations are broadcasting to. The most populous one is the one in the middle, Flatbush, and you can click a list and click a station and it will tune on the tuner.
This is JoeRadio.com, the Joe station that listens to you. Check.
Ooh. So anyway, so this is how you can use the map. It's I made it hopefully fun to play with. There you can also, as you play it, you can scroll back and forth and listen to different parts of the file. And there's an archive button where you can hear additional clips from the station. And I'm always adding to it. I'm seeking additional funding to improve the map and also to map the other areas of the city. So you might have noticed that there are a lot of Haitian stations. So of the 30 plus stations I can hear a night, at least a third of them are broadcasting in Haitian Creole. As I mentioned earlier, they're a very large group in Flatbush. This is a poster seen on the street. And this is a map of Little Haiti, a recently designated area in New York City, motivated in part by the increased gentrification that's coming to Flatbush. So it's to opportunity to stake some ground to try to enhance the community identity. So the Haitians in Brooklyn, they're actually well established in New York City even before the pirate radio stations. There were these stations called, they were running under a legal system called the Subsidiary Communications Authority. There will be a test on that later. And essentially, that's a way that these stations would lease part of one of the two sidebands that support the signal. This is about as technical as I'm going to get, on a regular radio station. So they lease one of the sidebands, and you need a special radio, often just tuned to that one station that you obtain. So these stations, like Radio Panu and Radio Shama, which is down here at the bottom, they started in the late 80s, towards the end of the Papa Doc and Baby Doc regime in Haiti, to bring news to the Haitians in Brooklyn. Haitians have been in New York City since the 60s. And what happened was, when the pirate radio, the new era was dawning in the 90s, a lot of the people who worked for the subcarriers got the cheap transmitters and started their own stations. So now there's at least a dozen a night that broadcast to this area. So I talked to this gentleman, he's the director of the Haitian Studies at the City University of New York, CUNY. and he's based at Brooklyn College, which is in the zone of these stations. So I asked him about the ties that Haitians have to radio.
Restez en contact avec l'info nationale, internationale, toutes les heures, le matin et à fin des après-midi. À Radio Lumière, l'information nationale, traité commentaire.
The peasant in Haiti, why he's working on the plantation in his farm, you know he has a transistor. At that time we had two kinds of transistor. One was Sam and the other was, we say, Trident or Trident. And many peasants, they prefer to don't have money to buy tobacco, to smoke, but they will have money to buy a battery, you know, to put in the transistor because they want to listen what Voice of America in Creole we say La Voix de l'Amérique, what Voix de l'Amérique have to say about the politics in Haiti. You know, I think many of those people, because remember, the first generation of migration in the US, you know, the big migration was during the 1960s. And many of those people, the culture of transistor was part of their everyday life. So they still maintaining the culture of transistor. For them, you know, having a radio station is very important.
And in Haiti itself, they have at least 300 unlicensed stations, from what I've heard. So it was great to have contact with Joan and learn more about the Haitian scene. But one problem I was having with this project, even though it's a very public scene and accessible in so many ways, was to get to people who were actually running the stations. And one day, it just sort of happened by accident. I was out, I was recording on the street, I was talking to people, like, do you know about these stations? And getting person on the street style interviews. And then I was standing on a street corner and this guy called me over and he wanted to know, was I covering a recent gas strike, a hike in the prices, which was causing unrest in Haiti. And I didn't know anything about it from the traditional media. And then I said, hey, do you know about these stations?
My name is Joseph. Everybody call me Haitian because I'm a pure Haitian.
One thing I am interested in.
But the thing is this, before we talk, we'd like to see your ID.
Yeah. What I'm doing, I'm making a story about all the radio stations in Flatbush, and many of them actually don't have a license.
Thank you.
So how important are these stations to you for getting the facts?
They are very, very important in our communities. Because certain news, the main media will not give it to us and they will not care. So from those radios, this is how we get our information. The job that we're doing in this community, we know we're taking a risk, but most of the radio that you see in the community is not making money. We're putting money out. I'm a member of one of the radio. We're putting money out. We don't make money from the radio.
Oh, so you're a member of one of the stations?
Yeah.
You want to tell me which one?
Comedy.
90.5?
Yeah. It's one of the most popular ones.
What's your role with the station? Are you one of the owners?
There is no owners in comedy. It's a bunch of us, a bunch of young guys. We have to do something positive for our community and for back home also. Right now, at this moment, the Marine is in Haiti to protect their interests. And behind this, we don't know what's next. We don't know what's next. CNN don't show you this. Yes or no? No, it's not in there. BBC don't show you this. So what we do, we have people in Haiti that will call us and tell us what's going on. and will send us pictures. This is how we get our information and point it to the people.
So this is why that even though you get taken off the air,
Because they don't want the truth to come out.
but you'll go back on.
I still have family over there. My mother's still there. So I have to know what's going on. So the other people have to know what's going on to their family.
And in fact, later that day, I met up with Joan and we listened through the stations, and all the Haitian stations had call-ins with people back home to try to find out what was going on. They also play other roles in the community. Joseph told me that they find the elderly people who have Alzheimer's who have wandered away from home. He claims that they broke up a gang among Haitian teens and set them on the right path. They raise funds for local causes and for Haiti. Often boat rides throughout the West Indian radio community are used for fundraisers and parties. And Joan has told me that at the end of these parties, the station staff tells the audience, we are doing all this for you. And there's one more aspect. There's sort of, radio can operate as a time machine. And here's another quote from Joan.
Radio Élégance de la Reine de la Voix antillaise à New York, son programme secrétaire dédié à...
A lot of these stations, especially the Haitian stations, they have such an extensive music library that they will play songs. A song will come on the radio.
C'est clair, fanatique de mon Jean-Baptiste.
And all of a sudden my mom was like, oh my God, your grandma used to have this record and she'd play it every Saturday. And then all of a sudden she starts swaying and then she'll start singing the thing word for word for word. Now she's transported back to being on the island with the big radio that's a piece of furniture in the living room and thinking about when her friends are over and they're having like a little house party and there people are chatting, little drinks are flowing about, you know, my grandmother milling about in like a gorgeous dress, you know, serving people. So it's kind of like that whole nostalgic era that unfortunately was probably lost because of the whole political turmoil in Haiti. So it's kind of like hearkening back to a good time. To a simpler time, a better time, a more carefree era.
So now we have a sense of what the scene is like today, and I want to jump back to see sort of the earlier era and how it got to today. So back in the 70s and 80s, the dynamics were much different than they are now. There were stations on the air. They were not like these. They were not targeted towards immigrant groups. There were just a few, you know, a handful. They operated late at night and on just a few sort of chosen pirate frequencies. Now they're on like, from the bottom of the dial to the top. In 1982, the New York Times counted about 12 stations citywide, which was a lot really for any city at that time. The FCC was much more active. Sorry about that. And they had monitoring posts, and when they heard a station, they would go after it. So there was a lot of risk involved at the time. Listening to them, it sort of had a certain zing because when you heard one, it was like, what's this doing here? And it's like, you know, they could be invaded while you're listening. There was an air of uncertainty. The stations, they were mostly run by young white guys, electronic adepts, hippies, hackers, and they had weird names. And let's hear a little bit of that. I don't know why this is taking us to SoundCloud, but we'll cope.
New. It's now. It's hot. 91 and a half.
In the dull and commonplace occurrences of day-to-day radio, there's one radio station that will definitely stand out. That's WFRB 87.9 in Brooklyn. Instead of slick, professional, commercial, hypey radio, you'll get bad, distorted, buzzy-sounding, lousy-sounding, muffled, amateur, get-your-ego-off radio. In other words, a completely unique experience.
evening, ladies and gentlemen of the world radio system. This is WKOB Radio.
So that's Alan there, and he was sort of like the Johnny Appleseed of pirate radio. He would go down to the storied Radio Row in Lower Manhattan on Chambers Street, buy transmitters and hand them out to people, and they would loosely sort of call themselves the Falling Star Network. So at one point, late 60s, early 70s, he and a friend were running 2 stations 24 hours a day in Yonkers, New York, and then this happened.
Welcome, my friend, to W.
Oh, wait. Don't touch that dial. I have the right sound all along.
Welcome, my friend, to WXNN FM, a member of the Falling Star Network along with WKOB, and its sole purpose is for the enjoyment and presentation of entertainment and other truthful information.
The station's been doing very well. We're on the air pretty much 24 hours a day. And then at 5:30 in the morning on August 12th, in the year of our Lord, 1971, I had all these federal agents pile into my bedroom and wake me up, basically saying, Alan Weiner, get up, you're under arrest. And we went before a federal judge, and we pleaded guilty. We did, because we were in violation of the Communications Act of 1934 as amended. The judge looked at us and said, do you realize what you did? And I said, yes. You know, we were very respectful, and he didn't fine us, and he didn't give us any jail time, but he released us with a year's probation. He encouraged us to seek out legal avenues to be on the radio. We did, and that's the story.
All right, more music by DJ Centronic, DJ Dave Centronic on Nasty Radio, WJQR.
But we're not listening to that yet.
I learned a lot.
Anyway, pretend you didn't hear that. So, sorry about that, hold on. So anyway, Alan left the scene, leaving it to others. There was a sort of a code of conduct where it came along where the stations didn't operate 24 hours a day. They would stick to the late hours. They followed what one station owner called the Johnny Carson rule, which is you waited until the Johnny Carson talk show went off the air, and so you wouldn't be interfering with your neighbor's television set, and then they would go on and broadcast all night. Then, in 1987, Alan came back. He was running a legal station in Maine, but he still had this passion to get on the air in New York City, and he followed the model of the offshore stations in the UK, and he bought a boat called the Sarah. He got a lot of the pirates who were broadcasting at the time to throw in with him, and they started broadcasting in international waters off of Jones Beach on Long Island, and it didn't last very long at all, and they were busted after 2 days. There was an injunction. He was handcuffed on the deck along with a reporter from the Village Voice. And after that, he decided to go in buying time on shortwave radio stations, and a lot of the local pirates followed him. And the ones that didn't, they stayed on the air in New York City, and the scene kind of started to fall apart. There was a lot of infighting. People were snitching on each other. And that sort of created an opening for a new kind of pirate radio sound. So I noticed this starting in and around 1995. It used to be, as I said, that you would hear these stations late at night, and suddenly I started hearing a station every night, early, and they were playing hip hop and club music, and it was called Nasty Radio WJQR, and it was run by an unemployed neon sign maker of a Puerto Rican background named Richie, and on the air he went by Dr. X. He changed a lot of the rules. Aside from going on early and every day, he sold airtime to hip hop and club DJs. One of them was Dave Cintron, who was a UPS driver, and he was inspired by Dr. X to start his own station.
All right, more music by DJ Centronic. DJ Dave Centronic on Nasty Radio WJQR with Dr. X. Ugh.
I learned a lot of things through Dr. X. We used to laugh because we used to say he can make a transmitter out of pots and pans. That's how smart he was. You know, he would go to Radio Shack and he would buy all kinds of gadgets and build stuff. And then he got comfortable with me and, you know, he showed me the transmitter. So I was very fascinated with the whole pirate radio. And he taught me some things and then he sold me the transmitter.
For security reasons, I'm broadcasting from an undisclosed location because the subject of tonight's American expose is terrorism.
It was a really big, clunky transmitter. It was like all tubes. You know, once I bought that, then we put the antenna up. And then I started, and then I decided to call it, you know, since we knew we were doing something that was bad, we decided to call it WBAD Radio.
Yeah, this is badass radio. Yo, what's up, boys? What's up with those radio stations playing love songs all day long?
Hey, yo, I never knew love like that before. And I don't want to know love like that no more. I'd rather hear that ill shit than some tracks playing. We don't play no commercials, so son, what you saying? Bad radio, power station, not creation, sponsors and censors. We got no relation, never break up like Jodeci and Devante, Centronics, Mystic, Carlito, Pagante, Sinister Cause, DOT, Vigilante. If you want to battle, let's make the bet up the ante. We can get ill for real and still go to heaven. Bad radio, Sundays, 5 to 11.
Yo. Go by the name of Dren Star. I was born and raised in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. You know, we provided 4 or 5 hours of just non-stop raw hip-hop that people were just fiending for at the time. Where they didn't have to buy a mixtape and they didn't have to go in around. They could just be wherever they were at, in the park, in the barbershop. We had a lot of barbershops. That's all the talk of the town goes on. You know, that's where we got a lot of love. We were the only ones at that time providing us a platform for the type of music we were playing. We played all the dirty versions. We would do like a touch run. I would be in the car and try to go as far as I can, and the signal was nice and crispy, and you know, we would know what zones we were hitting hard by our callers. First thing we would ask them was, where you calling from?
Where you calling from?
Calling from Flatbush right now.
Yo, stop out, man. What's the hottest station, baby?
91.9.
I got it right.
What's up, man? Where you calling from?
It got big, you know, we got a lot of love, and eventually when you get too big and you do something illegal, you know, they come knocking on your door. So that's pretty much what happened there. We got a little too big.
Ooh, foreshadowing. You can find out more. Actually, I made a documentary about this station, which is on a great podcast called Lost Notes from KCRW, Outlaws of the Airwaves. So this is an article about WJQR. They actually, WJQR and WBAD would share the frequency, and this is where WJQR was located. And this was the main transmitter of WBAD, but by the end of their tenure, they actually had a connection to Dren Starr's apartment in the public housing in New York City. So it was actually a pretty sophisticated operation. So towards the end of their tenure on the air, the airwaves started to fill up, and a lot of it was Caribbean-oriented programming. This was the dawn of that scene, and DJ Centronics, he went by the system that had been previously established, that if you were on a frequency, and 91.9 was the primary frequency, you were entitled to use it. You had seniority, and that started to break down big time.
There would be times we would broadcast, and then you would get like a station, you know, who they knew we were broadcasting at that time. We had a situation one time that they broadcasted over us, And that was a total disrespect because we took pride in what we did. So we knew who these guys were, and you know, we were like the FCC. We had a tracker and we tracked them down, and I made them shut it off. And they actually did. After that, they never did that again. And we had a situation also, I believe, somewhere in downtown Brooklyn where they wouldn't shut it off, and we said, hey, you know, this is our time slot. What are you doing? You know, you can't broadcast over us. And he told us, screw you. So we went up and we tracked them because we had the tracker, and we cut their wires.
And they would actually, Dren told me this, that DJ Syntronics and Dr. X would don like these blue shirts, and they wanted to give the impression that they were actually from the FCC. And, you know, it wasn't, you know, they didn't act badly, well, except for cutting the wires, but what they wanted to do was to talk to them and to say, hey, we were on this frequency first. But it got crazy, and by the end, DJ Syntronics would broadcast a dial tone over the stations that were interfering, like sort of a kind of jamming, like, you know, Moscow would do to the Voice of America. And Dr. X would get on the air and start pretending like he was preaching, and then he would start cursing, and so they were just trying to do all kinds of things to get the stations off. But it was kind of a futile battle. So who was coming on the air? All these Caribbean stations. And DJ D-Life was an early New York City radio DJ, and he came on the air essentially, or these stations, because there were no other outlets for Caribbean radio at the time.
Launch up the big station, NYC, baby. Watch it, yeah, she done, man, yeah, she done, man.
There was no mainstream radio station giving you Caribbean music on a mainstream level. If you could get the transmitter and you could set it up, why not? Do it. The transmitters became easier to acquire, and you started hearing all these different pop-up stations.
If you're in the car right now, I want you to blow your horn and sing it. Sing with me. Sweet music, baby. Sweet music. I'll let you feel the vibe. Let me go.
Being down there in the studio, you know, summertime and it's hot, and there's no AC, we just have the fans going. Sometimes I'm in there by myself, I would have to take my shirt off. It's hot, but the energy, and you going, and the vibes. Underground radio, that's what we would call it. You know, being popular in the backyard parties and all the West Indian parties. It was only surrounded that they would approach. And, you know, when they approached, there was no hesitation because we didn't think then it was something illegal. You just look at it as, I get to be on the air, and you're excited. You just went with it.
So, a lot of interesting things going on, a very vibrant community, but there are harms to stations that were running legally, and particularly, unfortunately, a lot of these stations crowded into the non-commercial band, I think because they thought these stations were less threatening. So I talked with the program director of a beloved freeform radio station, WFMU, and this is what he had to say about trying to deal with what these stations were doing.
In one case, I filed a complaint about a pirate outside of Newark, New Jersey, that was broadcasting at the same frequency as our 90.1 FM upstate New York station. And it was operating not only as a pirate using the non-commercial band, but they were operating commercially. And they were selling ads, and it was a very long-running operation. It was a pirate radio station on the non-commercial band that was running as a commercial business with impunity for years. And I had my FCC lawyer file a complaint to make sure I did it right because I felt like I had all the information on them. They were being so brazen about what they were doing in terms of giving out mailing addresses and phone numbers and website addresses and email addresses. And we filed a complaint, and then we found out that the FCC already knew about them, that the FCC had already received numerous complaints about the same station, and they had yet to take any action. And that station is still on the air.
So basically what happened is so many stations came on the air that it became impossible to enforce. So where they were taking Alan Weiner off the air, waking up at 5 in the morning, there wasn't a whole lot that they were able to do. Excuse me. So the FCC, they have a map, they show places they're enforcing. I think this probably undercounts things, but in New York, sorry, so, well anyway, there we go. New York, this counts 109 that they've had taken some sort of action. What the action that they take, they do something, they send you, if they find out, and they operate on a complaint basis. So if they get a complaint and they use equipment to try to track the station, and then they send that station a letter called the Notice of Unauthorized Operation, which says, hi, we've noticed that you are operating a station on this frequency. If you have a license for this station, would you please send it to us? Now, I actually interviewed the enforcement chief of the FCC. I'm like, they don't have a license, but it's a formality that they ask for. And if you get this notice and you go off the air because you're worried, then there's nothing will happen. You won't get penalized. If you stay on the air, then they send you the NAL, the Notice of Assessed Liability. So they'll say, well, you're still on the air, so we're fining you $10,000 for every day that you're operating illegally. Usually the operators ignore this or the fines get negotiated down. Not a lot happens. Sometimes there are raids on the station, but that's really very rare because usually the FCC, they don't want to go in to the neighborhoods without like a police escort. The police, this is not a priority for them to shut down these stations. What's happening now is new legislation, and with the Trump administration, of course, doing all these wonderful things to our country, in the FCC, whoever the president is gets to appoint the head of the commission, and now there is, they're saying now we're having a crackdown, and there's a commissioner, Michael O'Reilly, who is very fiercely opposed to these stations when he refers to them in quotes, stations, when he's talking about them. So the FCC is trying a number of things. They will find landlords who are hosting equipment, and they put pressure on Congress, and Congress now has an act called the Pirate Act, preventing illegal radio abuse through enforcement. They like acronyms, and it's passed the House and it's on its way to the Senate. It will raise fines to $100,000 a day with a cap of $2 million. I still don't think these stations are going to be able to pay it. It doesn't seem like it's has had much effect at the moment. And you can see at the bottom, there's no additional funding to do it, to go after these stations. So I think we're probably just going to be, I don't think things are going to change very much. Here are two different views from Rosemary Harold, the chief of FCC enforcement, and Joseph from Radio Comedy.
I think, frankly, for enforcement purposes, what really makes a difference is the kind of thing that the Commission is doing right now. We're doing concentrated actions. We're trying our best to make sure that people understand what we're doing and that we're doing it. We're going after folks who have been found to be illegally operating stations before and going after them again, so that the message gets out through the pirate community, through other means, that we're serious. And just because we've caught you once doesn't mean we're not going to come circling back to see if you're still doing it again.
To get a license from FCC, you know how much money it's going to cost you. We're not selling drugs. We're not doing anything illegal. Where are we going to get that money from? And they will never provide us if we air. Yes or no? They will never. FCC came to us, they shut us down too. But thanks God, we moved to another place. So like we were shut down like for months to look for a basement. This is what we could afford. We're gonna get an apartment.
So, were you there one of the times when people came by?
The last time they came, I was there. It was that 2 or 4 of us were there. We just sat down there talking about politics, making joke at each other. Then we had somebody's knocking at the door, and 3 persons came. They present themselves. They said, "Look, coming from FCC, we know there's a radio there." Then we denied it. We denied it. And one of them said, "Guys, listen, we know the radio is there, and the radio is on right now. Do us a favor, turn it off." So we told them, "Okay, no problem." We said, "Look, we're not going to give you any fine. We're not going to seize anything. We just want you to shut it down and take your antenna down." Which we did, because we have to respect the law. But they don't come very often, you know? When former President Obama was in power, we had a good work. But since the new president came over, everybody's running every 2 weeks now.
All right, so now we're going to look ahead to see what might happen. It's unclear. I see the number of stations as remaining high. New stations are coming on, and
Pirate Act stands for.
Oh, where did that come from? Anyway, hold on a second, bear with me. So, I see the activity as being in its mature phase. I don't think the Pirate Act is necessarily going to do that much. My thought is that gentrification will probably do more to end the pirate scene than any legislation. In the neighborhoods that the pirates operate in, there's a lot of new buildings coming up, and the character of the neighborhood may end up changing. I'm just going to refresh this so I can get my sounds back. Hold on. So a lot of the station's audience, they're listening elsewhere anyway. When I talk to a lot of people on the street, they're listening on SoundCloud, on YouTube, and other means. And when I talk with Dreadstar and DJ Syntronics, they're like, why are people even listening to the stations anymore? There's so many ways. But again, I think it comes down to the culture. But it's an open question, are they still relevant?
The story I'm working on is about stations that people set up on top of apartment buildings.
They do. Yeah. Like the college one does. I go, and I want to tell you one thing, I don't give a fuck. Have a good day.
Pirate radio don't have the streets anymore. Music is so easily accessed elsewhere. SoundCloud, YouTube, you can get it anywhere.
But, I don't think it's going to go anywhere soon. I've talked to another station on the Queens-Brooklyn border, and they basically set up the station to combat, there's a very sort of crime-ridden area, and they get on the air, and they get people to community meetings. They're the ones, on their Facebook page, they're posing with the police, because the police don't really realize that they're not a legal station. But they also told me that, I said, well, do you stream also? And they said, yeah, we get 50,000 listeners on our stream from all over the world. So I said, so why are you still on the air? Why do you take at least the theoretical risk of being on these stations? And this is what they told me.
What we're bringing to the table is something 100% clear in our conscience, giving back to our community with the current events from X, Y, and Z, public safety, to the good music from back in the days where that's all we had. We didn't have nothing else. We had a plate of white rice with 2 scrambled eggs because we couldn't even afford to even buy a piece of chicken from the grocery store. That's how bad it was for us. And this radio station that we provide to our local community is the only thing that we can give back to them. A little bit of love, a little bit of passion, and a little bit of the Caribbean music to make them at least feel good before they hit the tombstone and pass away, because most of these people are in the 70s and 80s. They're the ones that are listening to our radio station.
They can call us pirate or official, whatever it is, but we are still a family that will be still continuing to provide that service for this community. At least the authority is coming with another solution to fixing this situation. The day that they're doing it, so maybe we will think about it again. Until today, we're not ashamed of what we're doing it, and we'll be continuing to doing it until God gives us the opportunity to do it. That's for sure.
Thank you. I made a documentary for the BBC World Service, which has additional material about the pirates. So, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Hi.
Hi. Thanks very much for the lecture. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
I just had a question about I suppose, the changing demographics in these neighborhoods. It's interesting that people talk about so many ways to access music these days, YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, that sort of thing. It sort of reminds me of when FM started to proliferate. And so AM switched to more of a talk format. And I'm wondering if you foresee if that's a possibility for these pirate stations to move to mostly talk format.
To move to what?
A talk format.
Some of them do have a talk format. I don't know. I think the pull of music remains very high, but there is a mix of talk and political discussions. So I think probably it'll probably stay the same as it is. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.
I had a question about your research methodology for when you were in your house in Brooklyn, and you had the whole list of pirate stations that you could reach and the times of day. When you're listening, how do you know if it's a licensed or unlicensed station?
That's a good question. Well, for one thing, you can get a printed list of all the legal FM radio stations. Partly it's just because I'm a super radio geek, familiarity with the dial. So I know what's there and I know what's not. And generally, the kind of eclectic nature of programming is not heard as much. I mean, New York City, it's fairly eclectic and you will hear music from other cultures, but it's really rare to hear soca, reggae, dancehall. So it stands out. Also, the quality of the stations is different. If you compare it to a legal station, they don't have the same kind of finishing processing. So they have a bit of a different sound to them. A sonic difference.
And then do they make up their callers, WBAD, they just make that?
Yeah, that's right. Well, as he said in the thing, he said, well, because we were doing something bad, we called it WBAD. Yeah, WHOT, WFUN. In that day, they were kind of pranksters. Now, it's sort of, there's IRB Storm Radio, there's 999, which happens to be on 99.9. So, there are often names that come from the culture that they're operating. Kol HaShalom is one of the Sephardic Jewish stations that means the voice of peace, which actually alludes to a pirate radio station that used to operate in the 60s in Israel, which was a combination Palestinian and Jewish operated station. So it's usually a cultural marker. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned that there's a college within the range of a lot of the radio stations that you had mentioned, and that kind of sparks my question of is the range the definition of the community, and what is the definition between outgroups when the range of the station may not be necessarily the community that is being serviced, the patron necessarily?
Well, usually it is within the range, although you can hear it beyond the range. I've gone to Queens to listen to see what the radio scene is like there, and it's largely stations broadcasting in Spanish. However, I can hear several of the more high-powered stations from Flatbush, which are kind of bleeding into Queens. So radio signals know no boundaries, so they can go wherever they go, depending on the power. But usually, the pirate operators, they try to keep the power low enough to serve a particular area. But I've heard pirate radios, especially during the day, when the mass of stations are not on in Flatbush. I can hear pirate stations from New Jersey. I've heard Ecuadorian stations playing Andean type music. I can hear some stations from Queens. But usually it's sort of served in the area. And when I was talking to Joseph of Radio Comedy, I said, well, some people say that your transmitters malfunction and you interfere with the airplane communication. They said, we really try to keep it low. We try to avoid that. We try to keep it just to the community that we're serving. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. Yes?
Just two questions. One, do you know, is that pirate that was broadcasting with Newark, that was interfering with WFMU, are they still?
They are still on the air. I recorded that last November, and they're still on the air. So there's a real kind of stasis in enforcement. And again, it's the combination of the high number of stations, the bureaucratic nature of the enforcement, and the ease of getting on the air. It's relatively inexpensive. If the stations do go off the air, something like, oh, well, what happened to this station? And a pastor at a church station, he told me, he actually said, well, I'll talk to you, but I don't want to go on the record because our antenna was just taken down and I want to go back on the air, so I don't want to call attention to myself. I'm going to wait 3 months and I'm going to go back on. And that usually seems to be what happened. They lay low for a while and they get new equipment and go back on. And Joseph's Radio Comedy also told me the same thing. They move, they find another place, a basement that they have to rent. And so they're just always like trying, that's their strategy. They go off and then come back on.
And then second question, just to follow up on that gentleman's question about range. For the Brooklyn Pirates, do you have an idea of how many watts they're running?
That's a good question. They're probably, I would imagine anywhere from 10 watts to 100 watts, or maybe even more in some cases. I've heard some enforcement people and some other people think maybe even 1,000 watts, which is really a very powerful station. And that's where you might get some concerns about if there's a hidden transmitter on a roof, it's spewing radio frequency radiation, and that's potential concern. But it's on a roof and there's concrete, and so it's hard to know. It's not a 50,000 watt station like WNYC where there are signs like "Don't go near the transmitter" now. But I think they're fascinating and they perform a service. But there are problems. It's a complicated issue. So. Yes.
Thank you. I'm somewhere in outer space with this because the original stuff I knew something about. I trained, too many years ago to Sable with Carol Ford, actually.
Oh, wow.
And she went places and I just kind of lurked. But it brought me forward into what's still going on with pirate radio. And now I have been volunteering for many years with a community station out of Bridgeport, WPKN.
Great station.
Which might be the closest thing to legal pirate radio. And I'm just wondering if you have researched, I know that community stations have been dying out because terrestrial radio has been dying out. But I wonder if you've done anything with that community.
Well, I'm a big fan, and I definitely support those stations, and they're akin to WFMU. They're trying to hang on, and so if a pirate station is in their territory, then it can, especially stations that they don't advertise, but they raise funds through, if their audience is smaller, it makes it harder for them. John Anderson, the pirate radio expert, he advocates something like a harm reduction program where instead of taking the pirates off the air, you would go out to them and you would say, here's how to operate more cleanly. You're interfering with so-and-so, maybe you could turn this down or get a new transmitter or something like that. But I love those stations and I'm definitely supportive of them. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, I have a friend who's Haitian in New Haven. If she wanted to listen to some of those Brooklyn stations from New Haven, is there any way she could do that?
She can stream them online. So you could look at the names on the map, and you can find, most of them have websites or they have Facebook pages. So she could listen that way, but they would not go as far. There are, aside from New York City, Boston, and Miami, which are big zones, there are stations up and down I-95. We were driving up from Brooklyn yesterday. 87.9 is actually a good place to look because it's just below the dial. And I heard 3 or 4 different stations popping in and out of 87.9. Yes?
I was wondering if you had come across any people that were broadcasting from
spoofing locations, like vans or cars or anything like that?
I've heard about it, and I think that definitely happens. And the FCC will say on their site, you know, this is a pernicious problem now, particularly because stations can be mobile. So I know in the shortwave radio pirate realm, which is a little bit different, there are mobile stations. You know, they put an antenna on the car and they move here and they move there. I think also stations are moving their antennas physically. They'll take down an antenna here and they'll put it over there.
Is there some kind of like a VPN equivalence or like a proxy so you can like wander the waves somehow? Like if you have your main station here, then you transmit it to another one, which then bounces the signal.
Like ventriloquism?
I guess so, yeah.
I mean, you can certainly do that in the legal broadcasting realm, you know, do remotes. I think it happens. I don't know of any concrete examples, but I'm pretty sure that happens.
I can actually tell you some people I know, the equivalent of that, what you do is you have your antenna, you have a laptop set up, and you stream to the laptop. So when they trace the signal, all they're finding is the laptop. They're not actually finding where the studio the people are. So they'll see
Right.
the transmitter, but that you can replace for $1,000.
Yeah, I've heard of things like that too. Yeah, tell me how to reach those guys. Anyone else?
What about other countries having pirate radio? Do you find a whole lot of people in France or Italy or Japan or, you know, what's the South America? What's the
Yeah, it definitely happens, and it's happened historically. In London, for years, there's been a very active scene, you know, behind grime music, and it's still going on. It seems to be tailing off a little because actually, their equivalent of the FCC has been offering kind of like a carrot and stick. Like if you go off the air, we'll give you a frequency. But the media landscape is a little bit different. When I talked to Ken Friedman of WFMU, he was in Paris in the early 70s, and there were what they called free radio stations everywhere. In South America, it's interesting because there's not that much official community radio, and there are pirate radio stations, and they are sort of allowed to exist in a gray area because they're sort of fulfilling a function. And something similar, some people feel that during the Obama era, there was recognition within the FCC that there was a problem, but they were serving audiences that were not otherwise served. So as Joseph said, during the Obama years, we had a good break, and now we're running every other week. So, yeah. So,
other countries like Russia or Scandinavia or China or you know?
not that in China, there's a different kind of situation where stations from outside China will broadcast to China. Like religious groups will broadcast from Taiwan. There's something called the Voice of Hope. And there's also, especially in countries that may have a restricted media, other countries like in Germany with Deutsche Welle and the Voice of America from the United States, the BBC, will set up sort of like a proxy broadcasting into that country by shortwave, by AM and FM. You know, they can be jammed, but jamming is not absolute. You know, you can often hear through a jam signal. Russia, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Yes?
Technical question. I was curious about the guys who said, you know, we knew who was doing this, we tracked them down. With all the sophistication that, say, an FMU would have, is there no way to track these people and cut their wires?
Yeah, you can, but probably Ken Friedman doesn't like want to do something that might get him in trouble or in a violent situation.
But I would imagine there are a lot of listeners who are really upset about this. And
You know,
wouldn't somebody by now, because of all the available technology?
it's possible. It could happen. Sometimes the station goes off, and you know, I don't know why. Why did the station go off? Also, I don't think I mentioned this. Joan of the Haitian radio community says that the stations will, quote, narc on each other. So they will turn each other in because they're essentially competing for the same audience. That sometimes they'll have fights on the air and one partner will leave in a huff. So it's possible, but I don't know. I haven't seen concrete proof of that. Yeah. Also, I call of the Brooklyn Twitter Pirate Watch, he calls the interference of WFMU morally repugnant. He is really, some people are really upset, so I think some people are so upset that it's possible that something like that could happen. Because all you need a radio direction finder. It's not impossible to find these. I walk through a neighborhood just with a regular radio, and suddenly I hear interference, and it'd be, oh, it's probably around here. So if you were really motivated, you might be able to find it. Thank you so much. Yes?
Maybe just one more, sorry.
No, great.
Is there a station in particular, do you spend time actually listening to them, or are you more interested in kind of discovering them, or do you know?
No, I definitely listen to them a lot. I record them and I go through, like, gee, are they on all night? So I'll run a thing and I'll find out when they go on and off, and I'll look for IDs, because a lot of them don't really ID. So some of my recording is to figure out what's going on. But yeah, I listen to them, and some of the programming is really quite interesting. And it's just sort of a shame that the media policy is broken, that these people have no access to get on the airwaves even when they really want to. So if the FCC was a bureau of interesting hyperlocal radio, then these stations would be performing a good service, but they're breaking the law in the eyes of the FCC. So yeah, I listen to them. Part of my documentaries and work is what I find interesting about them, and so I'm trying to showcase the programming. Yeah, and some people are angry that I'm trying to approach it objectively and show the good and the bad. I was asked to do, when the map came out, I was asked to do, answer questions for an industry article called Radio Inc. And so I said what the map was about. And someone, a program director at Emerson University's radio station, said, David Goan should be prosecuted for even making it sound like there's anything worthwhile about these stations. So I'm turning myself in tonight.
That sounds like they're very important to a lot of communities.
They are. They definitely are. But it's hard to quantify. How many people are listening? Not sure. Some people I talk to say, I don't know what you're talking about. And some people say, oh yeah, I kind of know that, but I don't really know the name. Or, oh, I thought that was a legal station. So there's different levels of knowledge within the community. Thank you very much.